What's up, gamers? DreamcastGuy here, talking today about Resident Evil, because we're now coming up with the launch of Resident Evil Village, the 8th main entry in this series, and I've noticed that there's been a bunch of curiosity across the internet. A lot of people who have never in their life tried a Resident Evil game are kind of curious as to where they start, because keep in mind, the Resident Evil series has been going on for literally decades. If you count the main games, the spin-offs, the sequels, there are now over 20 total games, and it can be difficult to know where exactly to start. Well, today I want to try and help you figure that out, because I have actually beaten every game that's ever been translated into English, and I think that for the most part this is a seriously magnificent series. So I want to try and break things down into 3 separate categories to help you decide where you think you should start. Now we're going to begin with the essentials. These are the primary games that are great, they're still age good, they're still incredibly fun, and help educate you about the series. And then second, we're going to be looking at things that I consider the hardcore games. These are the things that are less required but are still just incredibly good experiences that I hope you'll check out. And finally, we'll be talking about the deep dive games. These are some of the entries that kind of suck, the worst Resident Evil games, but ones that I think can still be interesting after you've finished all the actually good aspects of this long-running franchise. With that being said, it's time to start with the essentials. It's kind of strange to think about, but nearly everything we know and love about video games today, especially from the horror genre, was pretty much invented by Resident Evil. This franchise was so freaking groundbreaking from the very start that even the earliest games coming out on the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation were completely revolutionary. But it's time to face facts. These games, as fun as they are, they've aged kind of poorly when it comes to graphics. They're a little bit clunky in the visual aspect, and so if it comes down to where to begin this franchise, I think it's best to begin with the remakes. You see, what they did is Capcom realized that these games are still such freaking gems that what they did is they went back and did a full-blown beat-for-beat remake from the ground up of the first, second, and third games. Now start with Resident Evil 1. This is on the GameCube, it's also been ported to the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, you can play it pretty much anywhere, and the thing is, the first game introduces you to some of the most important lessons of the Resident Evil universe. Things like saving your ammunition, trying to dodge these big old bioweapons, and kind of introduces you to the idea of zombies and the giant evil corporation of Umbrella. Now Resident Evil 2, these are the more modern games. 2 and 3 kind of take place at the same time. They're actually both in Raccoon City, and they introduce you to the characters of Claire Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Leon Kennedy, people who end up going on to become the main characters of the entire series. So playing these games, they teach you a lot about the series, they teach you a lot about the characters, and they teach you to care about Resident Evil. These games are visually stunning, but more importantly than that, they just have incredibly tight controls that allow you to easily take aim, pick off some headshots, and reload your shotgun in a very, very desperate situation. Now from here's where things actually get a little bit tough, because where do you go after beating the original trilogy? Do you go forward to Resident Evil 4 directly, or do you start to test some of the spin-offs? Well, in my opinion, the best choice is now to play Resident Evil Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0. Now, the reason why is that both of these games are still incredibly top-notch, they're very, very fun, but they're also the last time we really get a chance to fight directly against Umbrella. These are the last of the truly classic Resident Evil games that have tank controls, fixed camera angles, and a lot more focus on trying to scare you instead of just wanting to entertain you. Now, both of these games have actually aged incredibly well. They're both really, really good, and I've always liked the fact that they feel like the last of this old school style of spooky, still represented in a way that works well on current tech. These games are absolutely essential in my opinion, because they're really kind of giving us a chance to experience the darker aspects of this universe before things become kind of bright and fun and silly, which is definitely what happens at the beginning of Resident Evil 4. Now, Resident Evil 4 and 5, you should play these both back to back. Resident Evil 4 can be played single player only, Resident Evil 5 is fully co-op if you choose to do it, but these are definitely more of over-the-shoulder shooters. They're more about action and craziness. Characters have rocket launchers and do crazy flips and stuff to avoid huge tentacle monsters. They're not bad, I'm not going to act like they are, but they're definitely when the series takes a turn. From here on out, things are trying to be much more like an action movie and less of a horror movie, which isn't a bad thing, but that's why I think it's important to beat those previous games before you get to this point. They are both extremely good games. Before you move on, it's especially good if you actually take the time to do the side modes called Mercenaries. These are wave-based multiplayer where you actually get points and time for defeating zombies and monsters. They're incredibly entertaining, they still work super good, and they really give you a chance to relish the combat and craziness of this series before you go into the next phase. Now here's where things get a little bit more difficult. How do I determine this? Because if we're still talking about the core games, the things that are most important, I think you should jump over Resident Evil 6 and go straight to Resident Evil 7. Technically, if you were just trying to prepare yourself for Resident Evil Village directly, you could go straight from RE7 to RE8. I mean, seriously, they've designed it so the characters, the ideas, the concepts carry directly over. But I feel like the more of these previous games you beat, the more you can appreciate what's being built up in this universe and preparing you for the spookiness of Village, of fighting against werewolves and witches and whatever else might be showing up in that game. And with that, we've managed to finish off the essential games, the things that I think are the most mandatory to fully appreciate what Resident Evil Village is going to play like. But now we need to talk about the hardcore games. These are the ones that are a little bit weirder. Like, a lot of these are the spin-offs, they're these strange games, and I feel like they're the ones that are kind of the black sheep, the games that are not talked about as much, but certainly still deserve your appreciation. Starting, of course, with Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2. These are still pretty modern, and basically what these are is they tell the story of the characters in between the other major games. People like Barry Burton, and people that are showing up in the primary main games, but they kind of just disappeared. It's a chance to see the other tales that are happening in this universe in the battle against Umbrella. Now, these games are definitely a little bit different. They're a little bit slower. They're a little bit more focused on the characters and less on the crazy flipping off buildings and trying to use grapple hooks and stuff, but they're still incredibly top-notch games. This also brings me to another series of spin-offs that I feel like are not talked nearly enough about, which is, of course, Outbreak, File 1 and File 2. Now, these are separate games. They're technically online games. They're made and intended for multiplayer over the internet, and it's actually still possible to play them online to this day if you know how to set it up. Now, they're called File 1 and File 2, but in my mind, they fit together perfectly. These are additional stories that take place during the fall of Raccoon City. They give us a chance to see these other spots and other characters that were also trying to survive this madness. Now, these are less plot focused. They don't have a lot of dialogue, they don't have a lot of cutscenes, and instead are more about kind of just celebrating the spooky, great environmental detail of Resident Evil. Now, these games are really good, but they're stuck on the PlayStation 2, so you do have to track down some hardware if you want to experience it. And this also goes for Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles, which you are going to have to try and track down because this is on the Wii and the other one I played on the PlayStation 3. Now, these games are actually incredibly good, but weirdly, they're so often overlooked. They're very rarely talked about, but these are on-rails shooters. They're actually simulating the classic fighting style and stuff of those old school arcade on-rails shooters where you're trying to blast zombies as they pop up towards the screen. Now, what I like about this is that they give us a chance to play as some of the strangest off-the-wall people of the universe. People like Ada Wong shooting lickers in the head, or times where you're getting to play as Wesker, who's one of the major primary antagonists of the entire series. You get to put on his trench coat and play the role of the bad guy. They are great, and honestly, I feel like they're not respected enough for how much of a freaking gem they are. Now, in my opinion, at this point, after you've finished off all the other games, in order to truly experience the hardcore phase of being a Resident Evil fan, you need to go back and beat the original games. The first trilogy itself, which is Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3. Now, you can play these in a variety of places, but not on modern consoles. Now, the best way to do this, in my opinion, is, of course, beating it on the Dreamcast. Of course, I'm biased, I'm DreamcastGuy, but I think that this is an incredibly freaking good way to do it, and of course, if you mod your Dreamcast, you can play them in HD. This is a great way to do it, and it's a good way to experience those old school games that definitely deserve multiple run-throughs and a chance to see all that extra cool lore that established and built the bricks of this crazy big universe. Now it's time to go into the final phase, the last part of this video, which is the bad games. Now, not all these games are terrible, and in fact, I think that some of them are at least ideal experiments. They're things that I kind of appreciate for what they are, but they're not great. Some of them technically aren't even canon. Some of these stories technically don't even exist in the universe anymore because the writers just basically deleted them out of existence. But let's talk about them, starting of course with the first-person games. It seems like a majority of the more casual fans assume that this series has always been third-person, except for very recently with the release of Resident Evil 7 when it finally became a first-person shooter, when in fact this is not the case. If you go all the way back to the 90s, you'll discover these games that are called the Gun Survivor series, starting with Resident Evil Survivor on the PlayStation 1 and Dead Aim on the PlayStation 2. Now these are not spectacular. The controls are a little bit clunky, the graphics are kind of silly, but I still definitely like them for what they are. Like, they're definitely not the kind of games I regret beating, and I have done multiple playthroughs because they are kind of fun, because you could tell that it was them trying to toy with different ideas. Another one that's kind of not talked about that I really have a soft spot for, it's maybe the most hated Resident Evil game, but I just can't help but love it, is Resident Evil Gaiden. Now, I'm obsessed with the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. This was definitely the idea of, let's see if we can take the spookiness and put it on a handheld. And this was kind of a failed experiment. The combat is this weird like bar that bounces back and forth, and you click to shoot bullets at zombies. The dialogue is so freaking badly translated, like the game itself is a broken mess. But I still really appreciate it because it's something that just tries to be so different, and in that way it certainly succeeds at being one of the most unique entries of Resident Evil. Now, previously in this video we've talked a bit about the online Resident Evils, the games that tried to bring in the idea of fighting the undead with your friends. Well, they did this again. There's 2 additional games that came out that I personally just don't love, which was Resident Evil Umbrella Corps, which is a like tactical shooter. It's very, very clunky and weird, but graphically I do think is an interesting idea. Like, I still think that the idea of this art, seeing these monsters we know, but in a different style, they were definitely just trying to test out some fresh ideas. Same with Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. Now, this game is bad. In my opinion, it's one of the very worst of any of the Resident Evil games ever made, and the idea behind it, though, was definitely sound. Getting this final glimpse into Raccoon City before it's completely wiped off the map was a good idea, but just so poorly executed. Along with Resident Evil 6. Now, I'm talking about this as the final game on purpose because, in my opinion, you probably shouldn't play Resident Evil 6 until you've played every other Resident Evil. The story is bad, the controls are weird, the freaking themes of it are just so all over the place. Like, Resident Evil 6 is an awful game in my opinion. Like, it is a flat-out dumpster fire, but it is technically still part of the main series. The story that happened in that game, it's legit. It's actually something that's probably going to be referenced again someday, but it's something I think you should play after you've experienced all the highest highs and middles of Resident Evil. After that, you can expect to understand that there is going to be a couple extreme lows. This has been my thoughts, though. I think that wherever you start in the Resident Evil series, this is a fantastic franchise. Ever since its inception, it's managed to freaking terrify people all over the planet in every freaking language. I love, love, love it so much. It's still one of my very favorite series of all time. Thank you so much for watching, gamers. I want to do something special, which is in the comment section, please tell me your thoughts as to the proper order to try and beat each of the Resident Evil games. So if you're watching this video, if for some reason you don't agree with me, check the comment section. I bet somebody else has an alternate viewpoint. Thanks so much for watching, gamers. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. But do me the biggest favor of all, and keep dreaming. Oh my god, it took me so many hours to film this video, but you know what? Now I get to play a bunch of Resident Evil games and freaking get ready for Resident Evil Village. thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.